God of unchangeable power and eternal light, look favorably upon your whole church, that wonderful and sacred mystery. By the effectual working of your providence, carry out in tranquility the plan of salvation. Let the whole world see and know that things which were cast down are being raised up, and things which had grown old are being made new, and that all things are being brought to their perfection by him through whom all things were made, your Son, Jesus Christ our Lord, who lives and reigns with you in the unity of the Holy Spirit, one God forever and ever.
Amen.
Thank you. It is my honor and my joy to introduce to you Jack Roper. He is a Carolina educated fellow and the chair of history at Emory and Henry in the past. I consider him a dear friend and a wonderful parishioner and member of the congregation and church. And delighted that we have you here to kind of spread out some of the recent history or the history that we've recently found. Through you and Marcia's work of wanting to capture all this history into an archive that will be available for generations later to be able to discover what we've discovered. So without any ado, Jack, thank you.
Thank you, sir. I'm talking today about a couple who were very important for worship service here for the years 1903 to 1923, and also for education here. That's Ben Butler Martin and his wife, Viola Blasco Martin Lady Brown. And I dedicate my remarks to a couple who've been terribly important in my own life in both education at Coastal Carolina University, where I work, and at this church where I worship. And that would be Ron and Judith England. Appreciate Judith being here. In getting ready, I found from Father Finhagen, he was just a fascinating man. He had a little document that is useful to me. It's the old prayer book, the one that was used by the people that I'm talking about today. They didn't use the 28th prayer book because they were gone before the 28th prayer book came. Father Will showed you the We prayer book, and this is it, but there's lots of notes in it because Father Finhagen put things in the notes. And it is interesting. I use it as a study because I don't want to get out beyond the people that I'm studying. I want to be true to what they were doing. The calling for today, as assigned them, is different. We beseech thee, Almighty God, look upon the hearty desires of the humble servants, and stretch forth the right hand of thy majesty to be our defense against all our enemies through Jesus Christ our Lord. It's different from the collect we read. The epistle today is Paul writing to followers the way at Ephesus, and he speaks of light and things being manifest is different from what we read today. Also warns against fornication in some detail. We have the gospel reading is not the marvelous one that Father Will is preaching about, but is rather from Luke, as we have Jesus casting out a dumb devil. Father Finhagen marked in the back here, in that era, you didn't have the 3-year cycle of Bible readings, which meant you didn't get the whole Bible read. And I checked to see just what was read. And almost nothing from Exodus, I think because our lords of the land didn't want slaves reading about escaping from slavery. Also, the psalm for today, Psalm 95, is in here, but a lot of psalms are missing, including what astounded me, my personal favorite, 23rd Psalm was not in here. As for the Gospels, not all are in here, and the emphasis on speaking about freedom, and plenty of Paul, including where Paul reminds women to sit down and shut up. 1903, Benjamin Butler Martin was, as Father Will was saying, way up north. He was way up north in Peak, in Newberry County. At least 4 counties, northward and westward of us. And it's unusual in that his people there in Peak had been born in freedom. He could go back several generations into freeholding farmers, even during the time of slavery, and also learned how to read and write, which was not supposed to happen for people of color. And I will say, too, that in this period of time, the word used is colored, with an emphasis on the lighter your skin, the better. As you will see, that will become a problem. And also Negro, but all other terms really are not used. So I would use the terms they used. Benjamin Butler Martin, that name is an abolitionist Union general. One who liberated the city of New Orleans quite early. At the time, it was the largest and most important industrial center in the South. Atlanta would become important much later, but not before the American Civil War. In fact, Columbia was larger than Atlanta before the Civil War. New Orleans fell early, and there were efforts to recapture it, and Benjamin Butler was able to keep it safe within the Union lines. There were a number of well-educated black people who were free in New Orleans, and they supported Benjamin Butler. There were also, of course, a huge population of darker people who were slaves who were freed by Benjamin Butler. He established a postal savings bank where nobody in the South really dealt with money, but you could put money into the bank and earn interest, and you could borrow at low interest, and that was run by Benjamin Butler. There were several efforts to recapture New Orleans, and Butler successfully defended New Orleans against those efforts to recapture. He eventually roamed all over the South and came right here, right where we're standing, and supervised Mr. Lincoln's plan. Lincoln was dead and gone, blew his brains out, but his plan to take some of the land that was intestate, that people had died without saying where it was to go, and give it to the former slaves, something that I guess today we would call reparations. That was the plan, and Benjamin Butler was involved in that plan. Through it, the Reverend Bruce Williams, who was born in Richmond Hill and learned how to read and write while there, despite being the slave of one of the cruelest masters along the neck, the Reverend Bruce Williams was able to buy quite a number of acres, and he gave 20 of the acres, basically where we're standing, to members of the Brown family who traced back to a man from Ghana, appropriately named Abram, who produces the main core of the people who started our churches, and we got to say both of them, Holy Cross and Faith Memorial. There was also St. Mary's that was over toward the landing at Waverly. For his efforts, Benjamin Butler was known by my grandfather, for whom I'm named, who was born the same year, 1878, as Benjamin Butler Martin. He was known as Beast Butler. After all, he had fought for the Yankees, he had liberated black people, and he had gotten them land and schools and savings banks. And these were, as my namesake saw it, bestial things to do. Benjamin Butler Martin, following 3 generations of his family, learned how to read and write and was able to get school accreditation and set a goal to become an Episcopal priest. He fell in love with Ellen Glasgow, and Ellen Glasgow was also child of a free man. Her father, Matthew Glasgow, was an important preacher in the area, very pietous Methodist. However, he supported the Episcopal Church and was pleased that his daughter would fall in love with and marry someone who planned to be an Episcopal priest. In this period, 1903, the dominant force in South Carolina was, of course, no longer Benjamin Butler or anybody involved with northern ideas of liberalism or whatever. Benjamin Ryan Tillman was in command, and he had brought for us in our state constitution Jim Crow. And Jim Crow is large and sprawling. Its main feature was to make it very clear by law and practice that black people were not only not equal to white people, they weren't really human. And he took away the right to vote that had been enjoyed, particularly in this county, and took away the right to hold office, although we had quite a number of people right from this county who were black who had held office. And he tried to make it impossible for black people to learn how to read and write. And all of that was Jim Crow, but a larger feature in Jim Crow that we forget at our peril was the killing of black people. Benjamin Ryan Tillman gave parties at the governor's mansion, and also later in the Senate celebrated each time a black man was lynched from a tree, as one was behind our tree that's behind our altar, and thought that was an occasion for toasting the group, almost always professing themselves Christians, who usually with help of Christian ministers had performed the ritual of killing a black person without trial. Not always men, they killed whoever they had to, and they learned, as terrorists do, that a baby, whatever you do to a baby, particularly left in a public place, will make an even more profound impact on the people that you're trying to terrorize. Tillman did good things too. He regulated the railroads. I wouldn't mind turning the Pitchfork Bend loose on Norfolk Southern today. And it was the same company that was giving trouble then. He regulated the railroads. He was important for legislation that he worked with Teddy Roosevelt to produce, to bring some serious controls on the railroads who were causing a lot of trouble more than 100 years ago. He built Clemson and he built Winthrop, and these things are good, but he also is personally and directly responsible for the killing of a lot of black people. What exactly do you do in response to Benjamin Ryan Tillman? We have the initial dominant response from Booker Tolliver Washington. This book is available in our library here. I always like to tell people if we have books that are available. I had a friend who used to sneak over the library and put books in the library so that we could honestly say they were there. But this one was ordered through normal means. Booker Tolliver Washington, in 1895 in Atlanta, had given an important speech. And he was born in slavery near where I used to work. And Tolliver's an old white Virginia family. And he emphasized practical education, industrial education. He also emphasized staying away from white people, living with Jim Crow, not challenging Jim Crow. In Atlanta, he gave a speech, and it so moved people that the governor of Georgia ran forward and hugged him. And the governor's white man, of course, born in Chapel Hill. And when he held his dusky hand high above his head with his fingers stretched wide apart, he said to the white people of the South on behalf of his race, "In all things that are purely social, we can be as separate as the fingers, yet as one as the hand, in all things essential to mutual progress. Fingers and hand moves forward, the fingers are separate. Very popular message at the time. His practical education was to be what we would call STEMs today. And no fooling around with poetry, the arts, humanities, anything of that sort, the practical. C. Van Woodward, in looking at Booker T. Oliver Washington, says he took the classical virtues of humility, simplicity, and service, and Woodward's words, perverted them into humiliation, simple-mindedness, and slavery. Benjamin Butler Martin and his new wife, Ellen Glasgow Martin, didn't like Booker T. Washington, and they did not intend to be teachers or preachers who preached the hands being separate, but they were looking for the right person to follow. In 1903, they found him. William Edward Burghardt Du Bois. This also is available in our library. This picture, he's darker. He actually was extremely light-skinned and had reddish hair, blue eyes. W.B. Du Bois wrote in that year, Souls of Black Folk. It was Hegelian idealism of the romantic German variety. He had earned a graduate degree at Harvard. He had gone to University of Berlin, at the time probably the best school in the country. At least my son, who is there all the time, insists so. And he's very German idealist, influenced by Hegel. With Hegel, the main thing is there's a thesis met by an antithesis that gives us a synthesis. And it spirals, ever widening. Other philosophers, two opposing ideas meet and one loses and the other, like the NCAA tournament, goes on. But instead, with Hegel, all things are combined. The ever widening, spiraling, upward. A pope declared it to be heretical because eventually you're going to get where God is. Eventually you're going to get where God is. Du Bois was, I learned, Episcopalian at the time. And he has, in this book, he has an interesting chapter on Alexander Crummell, the first black man to be ordained Episcopal priest. And he got his training at Harvard, and then also went to Cambridge, which, although not as good as Berlin, is still pretty good school. And this idealism in here, he looks at Crummell and he lays out a pattern that would be followed by Benjamin Butler Martin and Ellen Glasgow Martin. Speaking of Crummell, he would gather the best of his people into some little Episcopal chapel and there lead, teach, and inspire them till the heavens spread, till the children grew, till the world hearkened, till, and then across his dream gleamed some faint afterglow of that first fair vision of youth. And this tremendously inspired Benjamin Butler Martin and Ellen Glasgow Martin. It also inspired people in Charleston, where the man of name for was, who was not inspired by this, and where a fellow named Dick Harleston was, and another man named Dick Mickey was. These men were students of Du Bois in Atlanta University, who then came to Charleston. They are Charlestonians, but they were educated by Du Bois. And early in the 20th century, they established Calvary Church, which would give us Baskerville, that I wrote his name for. They established Calvary Church as a center of Episcopal idealism and protest against white racism. And they also established what was quite extraordinary. They established a kindergarten. Nobody was doing kindergarten in 1903, but here's Harston and Mickey, following Du Bois's lead, establishing a kindergarten for black children in Charleston. Du Bois personally came to Charleston to see his old students and to sign people up for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. In the full disclosure that we're supposed to make, I'm a lifetime member, though I was not there in 1903. Du Bois came, and before very long, he had more than 690 members of the NAACP. He was the editor of their magazine called Crisis. He had 690 members of black people joining the NAACP, despite the fact that teachers were fired for being in the NAACP. That was still true when I was starting school. And despite the fact that nothing was thought to be more radical or more wrong among the white people in the state. So 690 people is a spectacular number for Charleston. The man in charge of Christian education for the parochial schools sponsored by the Episcopal Church was Edmund Joyner. He was, like Tuma Porter that we've studied, interested in industrial practical education, science, math. He was a little nervous about challenging segregation, and unfortunately he left before too long. And there was a period of time we had nobody, but before he left, he called Benjamin and Viola Martin to come to what was thought to be the most benighted, out of the way, backward, hick place that there possibly could be. I was amused the other day when Father Will had y'all talking about the privilege that exists in Paul's Island, and how easy it is to raise money here because everybody's rich. And the people in Charleston, admitting that Charlestonians tend to look down long aquiline noses at things, really regarded it as the most backward place that you could possibly imagine. Before Baskerville came, Ben and Viola Martin came. And they set up what were called pray houses. It was not this building. The footprint of one of the pray houses is over there in what we call Miss Ruby's garden. I'd like us to use both Holy Cross and Faith Memorial because they're not one thing, they're more than one thing. And they're not one place, they get moved around a lot. They were flimsy pine board buildings. The outer wall and the inner wall were the same board. And you could see the ground through the floor. And you could see the outdoors through the sides. But in these flimsy and rickety buildings, Holy Cross for a while was called Holy Cross Brook Green and was here and was in command of Viola Martin. Even though Paul says women just sit down and shut up, she couldn't really be a priest, neither could Ben for that matter at that time, but she could lead services. Father J.E.H. Galbraith over at All Saints could come over and bless the elements. And the Episcopal Church women who got started that early, they arranged for fair linen cloth and for things to be set out. And although it was a rickety little flimsy church that eventually would just fall down of its own weight, the other black people who didn't call themselves black in the area, the other people of color, said that the people at Holy Cross and Faith Memorial were uppity. After all, I mean, look at Du Bois. Uppity. Hegel says go up, and the Martins say go up. And then moving beyond class and race in a way that will be dangerous in our part of the world and will be resented. Not too far from us, over where you today have the Child Development Center on the Parkersville Road. That's where there was a public school, and it was in the Washington model, then called Tuskegee Hampton, the two institutions most associated with Washington, with emphasis on science, technology, engineering, math, and training people for practical education. No poetry, no music, no philosophy, no humanities, no fine arts, none of the stuff I've taught over the years. None of that to be done. Here, well, there actually, the opposite was going on. Oh, they taught them math, but they emphasized philosophy, they emphasized literature and the arts. And Du Bois would often say, Beethoven is mine, Plato is mine, Hegel is mine. And Du Bois would also emphasize something that I used to tell kids to irritate them. Beethoven was part black, so he can be mine, as Du Bois says. Hegel, as far as we know, was white alabaster as could be, but still he belonged to Du Bois. The Holy Cross Church would also later get set up over near Waverly, and that's where Ms. Doc Bond, who brought me into the church, that's where she worshiped, and that's where we have the cross that's on display in the narthex. That's where that came from. The pray houses, the pray chapels, and parochial schools were about 5 miles apart. Originally, the idea was that Holy Cross here would be run by Viola, and Ben would run Faith Memorial, which was over near the Waverly Landing, where Mr. Lashcock had the mill that was terribly important to everybody, not only for milling rice and milling other things, but also for employment. And the post office was there. And everything went up and down the Waccamaw River, and there was a mail boat that would deliver the mail. And you had to go over to Waverly Landing to get the mail. And they still today, I went out the other day, tried to imagine moving with a mule, going not too many miles an hour. So it takes a good hour and something to get from here to there to pick up the mail, or to go to Suber's feed and seed store where you got everything. Almost immediately, Faith Memorial here and Holy Cross then over toward Waverly became the hominy churches, Although the people had, they were by no means rich, they were in fact poor, they had plenty to eat, and they established the precedent of giving the food away. I don't think Ben and Viola created that. I think that was going on from the 1880s, but Ben and Viola brought it to a high level of art, one that would be worthy of Renee Ford, who's got her food here for distribution. The hominy churches. Father Galbraith would come over and bless the elements, and then as licensed lay leaders, licensed by, we have 3 straight liberal bishops. This was Capers, who would be liberal and believed in integrating the church, and argued constantly. The Episcopal Church were always different. The Episcopal Church, unlike the Methodists and the Presbyterians and the Baptists, did not create a Negro church. There's no equivalent of AME. Instead, the Episcopal bishops insisted everybody's Episcopal, following in that case the Roman Catholic idea. Everybody's Catholic, everybody's Episcopal. You can't have a Negro branch. In fact, of course, as we often do in the Episcopal Church, we pronounce one thing and do something else. So Benjamin Austin, a brigadier general in the Confederate Army and child of the Austins, tried to follow what his bishop had said in bringing black people into his church. And I mean, Confederate general, child of the Austins, you can't get much better redneck credentials than that, can you? The folk there just revolted. They stood at the door and chased the Negroes away from the church. And Austin, with all his name and everything, he was a soldier. That's the way it was. Bishop Gary replaced Capers and came to know the Martins well. Gary is an interesting person. His father, LeGrand Felder Gary, had been the priest at All Saints, where Rita and I attended for a while till they later chased us out. And LeGrand Felder not only was in charge at All Saints, he was in charge of, Bishop Thomas wrote a history that I've got, and he incorporated in it reports of colored ministers. And in that document, I find that LeGrand Felder was in charge of no fewer than 6 different churches everywhere. I mean, throughout the PD. Think how long it takes you to go somewhere in a truck in the PD, and it was longer when you were going on the river or going with a mule. Remember that in order to do service, you didn't always have a priest there. A great deal of the time, especially these colored Episcopal churches, a great deal of the time, some lay leader licensed by the bishop was in charge of things, and you were taking your communion, which was religiously and seriously taken. You take that after it's been blessed weeks before. You'll see a priest 3 or 4 times a year. You'll see the bishop a couple times a year. Now, LeGrand Felder's boy, William Alexander, who became the bishop and was very useful to us here, he had grown up traveling around with his father to these colored churches, and had grown up in a world where there were about 90% black people. And he was quite used to being around black people, and insisted that there was one Episcopal church, one diocese, and the black people were just as much a part of it as the white people. And he very much wanted to ordain black ministers, including Benjamin Martin. There were several problems. One problem is Ben Martin was so busy teaching a couple of dozen kids and handling the food bank and the Harmony Church. He was so busy that he didn't have time to go. Of course, didn't do divinity school here in South Carolina. They did it in Virginia. The Virginia Theological Seminary set up a seminary in Petersburg, which originally called the Colored Divinity School, and later came to be named for James Payne, who was an ambassador to Liberia and one of the first black men to be ordained. Later, that school became the Bishop Payne Seminary, and important black people were educated there. I looked through the canons, because the canons interest me, as all things in our church interest me. And I saw that you really were supposed to know enough Greek to make your way through the Gospels. And you were to know enough Hebrew to make your way through at least a part of the Tanakh in the Old Testament, including those parts where God frees people from slavery. You were supposed to know enough of that. And you were supposed to know enough Latin to make your way through the collects, which we know also are the collects, and the various prayers that you were doing. And so you needed people who could teach Greek, Latin, and Hebrew. Bishop Payne's school had that. They had qualified people to teach people Greek, Hebrew, and Latin. And you could do all the things that you were supposed to do that the white people were supposed to do. There is a safeguard that they put in there, that the bishops put in there, nervous that maybe somebody would slack off and not really teach people like they should in divinity school. You had to go, after getting your education and getting your Master of Divinity, you had to go before the bishop and presbyters who were ordained priests that the bishop had gathered together. There had to be at least 2. It was suggested there'd be 25. There had to be at least 2. And they would then quiz you in Hebrew, Latin, and Greek on these things you're supposed to be able to do. Now, I learned a little more. Yes, sir?
That's still the case. That part hasn't changed.
Yeah, I'm not one of these guys saying it used to be tougher in the old days. Looking at the canons, though, I find that that safeguard could be used the other way. You could not only make sure that the divinity school had taught you right, in an unusual case, if you really had a good person, it would be a man, who could be a good priest and hadn't been able to finish divinity school, the bishop and the presbyters could arrange all of that. If you still went through your period being a deacon, like we have here.
I'm still waiting. I ain't learned that Greek yet.
If you had been through the other things, you also had to have, and this may be that you had to have testimony that you were a sterling character. Yeah. Anyway, Benjamin Butler Martin needed to get away from his many duties here long enough to go to Bishop Payne Divinity School, and they kept saying they were going to organize it, and it just never happened. It just never happened. So he instead remained as a lay missionary. If you look at our quilt that Peggy Wilson had done for us, and we do, Marsh got a good picture of her standing with it, you will see that Ben and Viola Martin are listed as lay missionaries, as they were. The Martins in both places emphasized learning the Beaux-Arts and going to church, and as Ron and Judith tried to do in their institution, combined values, clarification, as Du Bois would want, along with a good solid grounding in all humanities and all sciences. The idea, not always brought to fruition, is that Viola, who was usually called Ms. Viola, would take the kids from 1st grade through 4th grade. And Mr. Ben, he was usually called Mr. Ben. He was also sometimes called BB. You can stand up for yourself, and still you might not want to emphasize Benjamin Butler too much in an area where the Ku Klux Klan is so overwhelmingly powerful and prevalent. So BB, or Mr. Ben, he would take everyone from 5th grade on, and in South Carolina, if you had 8th grade education at that time in the 20th century, you were thought to be educated. There was high school available in Georgetown, and Mr. Ben tried to get you ready to go into Georgetown, which you got to taking the boat. It was generally reported that the kids who came with Mr. Ben and Ms. Viola did well at the Georgetown school, as later they were always said to have done well if they came through in this building with Ms. Ruby. Ben and Viola had had two children originally. Richard Beeman, he was named, or sorry, not Richard, Benjamin, no, I'm sorry, it is Richard Beeman. He is named for Richard, Archdeacon of North Carolina, who would often come through here and help out in confirming and baptizing and even occasionally doing Mass for the 1,000-something black people who only had, I think, 3 ordained ministers dealing with them in this. Remember, the PD seems little, but if you're with a mule, it's a long haul between these pray houses. Beeman was a doctor, one of the very few white doctors who was willing to work with black people. And of course, there were no way for African American black person of color to get a medical degree in those eras. So you just said 2 or 3. You know the names: Flagg, Ward. 2 or 3 people who would do anything to help black people. If you look at some of our old videos that Marsh is digitizing for us and making available, you will see Nathan Brown. And Nathan Brown has written a memoir, and he looks at everything. And he says that he was 15 years old before he ever saw a licensed doctor. And he was in the family that was privileged and better off than others. So doctors are few and far between. So a doctor who was willing to help you was a rare and precious commodity. And so the boy is named for the Archdeacon and for the doctor, Richard Beeman. There's another boy, Garnett, and then there would come 3 more children. Things were going along with some real hope. Ben Martin is still hoping that there'll be this moment when he can take sabbatical from preaching long enough to get to Petersburg to, he's working on his Greek and Latin, but really work on his Greek and his Latin and his Hebrew, and take courses and be ordained. And then come back and be a priest, not only here, but other places. Kids are getting through and moving on to the Georgetown School, and some of them, they created Voorhees, which becomes a school that people of color can go to. Although if you want to be a priest, you still got to go to Virginia to do the Petersburg Center, the Bishop Penn Center. Then in 1923, when things were otherwise going pretty well, Ben Martin contracted pneumonia and was gone in a flash, as people were in those days, just gone. He was not quite 45. This left Viola with 2 pray houses, the Hominy Church distribution, the training of children at the upper level as well as the lower level, 4 of her own children, and 1 that she was pregnant with. This is a lot to lay on a woman, or anybody. What happened was that for a couple of years, I should add too that by then we had Erasmus Baskerville, and he had done a good job of raising money. He would, of course, go to the north because Yankees would give money for black education, but Southerners wouldn't do that. So he was good at raising money, and he reported that the American Bible, the American Building Committee had given him a sum of money so that this dilapidated Holy Cross could be replaced with a new building. And there would also be money to build a new building for Faith Memorial. And we would have 2 pray houses. This is important because there had been a beautiful church called St. Mary's that had been built by slaves and was beautifully appointed and had a beautiful communion service. And white people came in and took the communion service away and desecrated the graves. And this is, Father Will and I were talking about how not so many priests get buried across the street. Well, when Ben died, Viola thought, you know, I don't dare bury him here because the Ku Klux Klan will dig up his grave. So we'll get him back to Jenkinsville in Fairfield County, where the Martin family had arranged to buy about 200 acres and set that aside as a cemetery for people of color. And there was enough, that was so far in the country and there's so many well-armed Negroes that they were able to keep the Klan out of the cemetery most of the time. Not the case here. This cemetery was often a victim of vandalization. They'd had to abandon, obviously, St. Mary's, and the cemetery would be vandalized again, as we would know in recent years, so that some bodies were brought over here. And Father Will, working with other ministers, arranged for a wonderful service in which those bodies were properly reinterred again. But every one of them had been baptized by Father Lenny long ago, and they'd been buried properly. It just, their bodies had got moved later. So Viola arranged, and this was complicated because you had to get it in a wagon pulled by a mule to get the body taken back up for proper burial in a cemetery called White Hall. And while there, I wish the story, I'm a historian, so I can't make the story happy in all its aspects. The family was always pretty hard on Viola because she was dark-skinned. And so they felt like she was trifling, not being as light-skinned as they. And they criticized, she had nothing, but she had scraped together nickels to buy a coffin. And they criticized the coffin for being too cheap. And they didn't like it. And they made her time there trying to bury her husband. They made it hell. And she came back here delighted to get back here with people who wouldn't give her such a hard time. It was too much for her to do from 1923 to 1926. She did her best to train the 1st through 4th grade kids. The 5th through 8th grade went begging. And the Brown family remembers that very well, that there just wasn't education, and so you lost that important link to get yourself ready for the public school at Georgetown. In 1926, as Nathan Brown remembers it, Erasmus Baskerville was able to bring another graduate of Bishop Payne, Forsyth. Father Forsyth came, and he soon brought a woman he fell in love with in Charleston, Ruby, who really didn't want to come to such an out-of-the-way, backward, and poverty-stricken, disgusting place, but agreed to come. And they established the church in the nice building that was over there. There's a little more to the story. Viola, remember we got the Brown family. There's 6 children of, 6 grandchildren of Abram, 6 children of Wash, or rather of Abram's son. And one of those 6 children was Washington Brown, always called Wash. Wash had 7 children by his wife, and then his wife had died. And Wash was taken with Viola, who I think was good to look at, although darker than many preferred. And he asked her to get married. And they then together raised a dozen kids. And he helped out. He couldn't really help out much at school, but he helped out in distributing the hominy and other food. And although they were not qualified, these people did the medical care. They did something a little beyond first aid and were midwives and other things because there's just no white doctors available. Viola then, and the Martins then marry in with the Browns, who start at Litchfield Plantation and are our link back all the way. She marries in with the Browns and is Viola Glasgow Martin Brown. Also interested in the story, Richard Beeman Martin, the oldest boy, who in his desperate poverty was compelled to sell away his prize donkey, and even worse, his prize dog. Imagine being so poor you had to sell your dog. He was able through, remember Father Galbraith over at All Saints? He was able to read quite a great deal in theology and was prepared in order to go onward in his education to become a priest. It was also arranged for him to meet W.E.B. Du Bois, Dr. Du Bois, in Atlanta. And Du Bois was super busy, but he gave young Benjamin about 20 minutes, which was a lot in those days. And he told him he wanted to be a priest, and Du Bois is an Episcopalian as well as a communist. He said that that was good goal. And he told him something else that is real interesting. He said, stay in the South. All the interesting things are happening in the South. Don't be like all these other people of color running away to the North. Stay here. Make the South change. And this young boy was able to get an education at Allen with a full scholarship available to those who were completely broke. And then he was, in fact, it was while he was at Allen that he met W.E.B. Du Bois and had his audience. Then he was able to go to Bishop Payne School, and later he was able to go to the Union Seminary, which ironically had been created by South Carolina planters who wanted to have a divinity school to train white priests, and then it began to accept black priests. Benjamin Martin then is somebody from here, from our Pray Chapel, and what is the beginnings of our Holy Cross Faith Memorial, who became a priest. And not only a priest, but became Bishop of Long Island. And he's written an interesting memoir, Two Islands, Holly's Island, Long Island, and is the only person who would actually know both islands, Long Island and Holly's Island. He gives us a song, I won't sing, but I'll do a poem, that his mother, Viola, would say. If I can just hold out, if I can just hold out, if I can just hold out, I'll wear a starry crown. And he did hold out. Another irony, and I can't nail down all the names, but another irony is that in Long Island there was an Episcopal priest from our part of the world, who a white fellow, who then answered to the black bishop, and I find that interesting. Wrapping things up with a bow, not terribly long ago at a deanery, Father Will met Benjamin R. Martin Jr., an attorney who had practiced law in North Carolina for a number of years for the state of North Carolina when it had liberal governors. There actually was a time. And he did important work in civil rights and race relations. Then he retired to live in Horry County, and he came over here and went to the narthex and looked at Peggy's work, and he said, "That's my granddaddy. That's my granddaddy." And so then it was arranged for him to come to this building, and we interviewed him for our project, which goes on apace and will be the last book that I do. That's it. I can entertain questions for a moment, if there are questions, especially if I can answer them.
I would add that 2 weeks ago I was on Episcopalian Island. It's largely Gullah people.
Yeah.
There is the oldest building on the island is an African American church.
Mm-hmm.
Outside that, it appears like a little outhouse, but it is one of those little prayer
Mm-hmm.
houses that you're talking
Yeah.
about. It's been there for a long time.
Yeah. I should add too that these prayer book, the people, even when they were slaves, simply memorized it. They didn't have books to follow on. They memorized it. And when Bishop Philander Chase from Indiana visited Father Glennie, and he said, "God, I wish white people knew their prayer book the way these Negro slaves know it." And that remained the case with Ms. Ball and Ms. Ben. They taught the prayer book, and the kids memorized it. And if they had trouble memorizing it, there were, it's another era. There were leather switches to beat them with to make sure that the learning was reinforced. Well, Father Will has important things to say today.
I do want to share though that the fellow that I met, Richard, at the convention, he brought an artifact, and he won't let us have it, but it's the third it's the third example of this that I've seen in picture and in real life, but it's a simple conch shell, and on the inside is written Baskerville, Holy Cross Faith Memorial, Pawleys Island. And that was from the time of Miss Ruby and Rev, and I have a feeling that they did those as keepsakes, as souvenirs for those that would come through and help teach or that kind of thing. And so, but I've seen enough of those to see similarities. All the prints faded and then being redone with a permanent marker. But yeah, there's little things, just the little cute little things that you do for your guests, that we still do today. So a lot of the heritage, I hope y'all can hear echoes of it even today in what we do now. That's our hope. That's our prayer. Thank you, Jack.
Thank you.